From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, folks. My name is Norman Middleton. I'm one of the concert producers here at the library, and I'd like to introduce Stephen Brown tonight. But before I do, just a couple of announcements. On February 3rd, the symposium, Depression and Creativity, will be up on the library's website, hopefully by next week. So just keep looking, and it'll be there eventually. Also, if you could please turn off your cell phones and pagers, because we're on candid camera. So, Stephen Brown is one of the world's experts on the neuroscience of the arts. He is the director of the Neuro Arts Lab at McMaster University in Ontario, which is devoted to studying the neural, cognitive, and evolutionary foundations of the arts. The research there focuses in part on the mechanisms of emotion in both the creation and apprehension of the arts. And the lab has a strong interest in comparative musicological studies related to the evolution of the geography and cultural evolution of the world's musical styles. Dr. Brown is the editor of two recent influential collections of essays, The Origins of Music and Music and Manipulation, from the Social Uses and Social Control of Music. Here it is, good book. I've read it, it's good. The title of his lecture tonight is From Mode to Emotion in Musical Communication. So without further ado, Dr. Stephen Brown.
Okay, thanks, Norman. Thanks for the invitation to come here. It's a pleasure to be here. I see so many people in the audience. Can you turn me up just a little bit, please? Okay, thanks. Even though I'm a brain researcher, I'm not going to talk about the brain tonight. I'm going to talk about music and emotion, but more from a cognitive psychological perspective than from a neuroscientific perspective. When I talk to the general public, they always ask me about musical emotion, so I decided just to make my talk about musical emotion tonight. So it's going to be sort of psychological, cognitive. I won't talk about the brain at all. But if you have questions, I can answer questions afterwards about neural aspects. So I just want to talk about the psychology of emotion. And so there's been a long debate about the nature of emotion and psychology. And I won't go into it right now, but basically most people agree now that emotions are about something, that emotions involve a kind of appraisal of things. Oh, that wasn't one of my jokes, though. Okay. Emotions are about something, so they involve an appraisal. They're situational, they're induced by particular experiences or objects, and so they're based on making some kind of evaluation. Is this thing good for me, bad for me? Some kind of evaluation about the meaning, the importance of something for you. This is in contrast to moods. I guess you're going to be talking about depression, you'll talk about moods later on. These tend to be sort of objectless affective states. So an emotion sort of has a stimulus, an object that you can attach your evaluation to. Moods are a bit more amorphous and objectless. I won't talk about moods. I'm going to talk about emotion in this lecture tonight. So I just want to introduce sort of a few technical terms here, but the three basic dimensions of emotion according to cognitive psychologists. And these are valence, intensity, and focus. And so valence is the sense to which the emotion feels good or bad. And so most emotions feel either good or bad, not both, not neither. And so this is sort of, I say, a binary distinction. Most emotions have sort of a good for me or a bad for me feeling, and we call that property the valence of the emotion. Intensity, as you might imagine, is about how intense the emotion feels. So you can be glad, you can be ecstatic. You can be annoyed, you can be in a rage. Okay, so emotions vary in gradation, from low intensity to high intensity. And so while this valence is sort of all or nothing, one or the other, intensity is more graded. It's more of a continuum from low to high. Then the last feature, which is focus or quality, is sort of what the emotions are about, what kinds of appraisals are involved. And I'll talk about two different schemes for focus. Now, if you've taken a course in psychology or biology, you've learned about sort of the dominant theory of emotion, which actually goes back to Charles Darwin, and is called the basic emotion theory. And that's the idea that there are a handful of really fundamental, biologically based emotions, and typically in these schemes there's somewhere between 5 or 10 of these basic emotions. What's shown on this slide are some of the big ones, such as anger, sadness, happiness, fear, disgust, surprise, contempt. Like I said, these schemes tend to have between 5 and 10 of these basic emotions. And even though Darwin proposed this theory in the 19th century, it was sort of revived in the 1970s. And a lot of the work was based on looking at facial expressions. And so if you show these kinds of pictures to people from non-Western cultures, they'll make the same kinds of emotional interpretations, that this is a sad face, this is a happy face. And so some like cross-cultural universals in people's interpretations of these things. So again, this is a standard model that you learn about in psychology or biology courses. And me personally, I've always had a lot of problems with it. And so let me tell you some of the, I think, basic problems with the basic emotion theory. It tends to be sort of unidimensional, and so people don't talk so much about the valence and intensity aspects. So it just tends to be sort of these 5 or 6 categories of emotion. But also, psychologists who sort of enumerate or catalog human emotions come up with numbers like many, many hundreds, 700, 800, maybe 1,000 different kinds of emotions. And so talking about 5 or 10 basic ones, even though they may actually be very fundamental, it really underestimates kind of the richness of human emotions. So I don't doubt for a second that these things are very fundamental and basic, but they don't encompass all of our emotions. There are actually many hundreds, according to psychologists of emotion. Next, the theory has been very face-oriented, and so most of the evidence for or against it has been based on looking at facial expressions cross-culturally. Someone like me who thinks about music, I think much more about sound and the voice and less about the face. And so people in the basic emotion camp haven't really talked about emotions in the voice or in body gesture. It's all been very much based on face and facial expression. So it's been a bit limited in terms of the kind of evidence that's used to support it. And then lastly, for a long time in psychology, there was a real dichotomy between cognition and that there's emotion, and the two are very separate. And these days, the two are coming together, and I think the basic emotion theory hasn't really come to terms with the fact that emotion has a big influence on cognition. And so, for a long time, I was trying to think about alternative theories to this one. I came up with some of my own ideas, but then I discovered another theory from some American psychologists, which kind of encompassed my own ideas and went even further. And so I've kind of adopted the model of these two psychologists, Gerald Clore and Andrew Ortney. And so I just want to introduce that and then apply this to the arts and ultimately to emotion and music. And so for them, yeah, they think about valence, they think about intensity, but in terms of focus, they talk about there are 3 different basic kinds of appraisals that we make as far as categories of emotion. And so it's these 3 here, outcomes of events, aspects of objects, and actions of agents. So I'll just go through the 3 just to give you some sense of what these things are. So the first one deals with the fact that we have motivations and goals. If our goals are met, we feel sort of positive outcome emotions. We feel happy, we feel pleased. If our goals are somehow thwarted, we feel a negative outcome emotion. We feel displeased. Since I teach, most of my students don't have cars. I talk about catching the bus. So if you want to catch the bus is just about to leave, and you're running towards it. If it pulls off before you get there, you're going to feel anger, frustration, whatever. If the bus driver waits for you, you're going to feel pleased. So this is the category of emotions that are based on appraisals. You have these goals. If your goals are met, you feel this positive outcome emotion. If they're not, you feel a negative feeling like frustration. That's one kind of appraisal. Another kind is your appraisal of the properties of objects. And so certain objects, certain foods, music that you like, elicit these kind of positive, let's call them aesthetic emotions, a sense of attraction or liking. Other things have the opposite kind of thing. You feel a sense of repulsion or disgust or dislike. And these are different kinds of emotions than these kinds of outcome things. But this category generally can be thought of as your aesthetic emotions, having a sense of, on the one hand, attraction for things that you find pleasing, or a sense of dislike or repulsion for things that you don't like. So those are sort of the object emotions. Then the last category deals with the actions of agents, and these are kind of the moral emotions. So if you look at the behavior of people, in some cases you feel a sense of approval, you may feel a sense of pride for a friend who accomplishes something, or you may feel a sense of repugnance, disapproval for other kinds of things. And so this is the third category based on the actions of agents. These could be thought of as our moral emotions. So just briefly, these are some common everyday emotions from these 3 categories. So for outcomes, your goal-motivated emotions, happiness, contentedness, compared with frustration, anger, and anxiety. For your object aesthetic emotions, things like you feel liking, attraction, ecstasy, in contrast to dislike, repulsion, and disgust. And then for the agency category, feelings of pride and approval compared to indignance and disgust. People who've studied disgust find that the two things that people find most disgusting are feces and politicians, okay? So, but the point is that those are two different kinds of disgust, because the feces is this category, but the politicians is this category. I just gave a talk in Ontario about aesthetics, and I put up a picture of our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, and I said, how many people think Stephen Harper is handsome? And 300 people were there. No one, nobody raised their hand. And he's actually a nice-looking guy, but people think he's unattractive, not because he's unattractive facially, but because they disapprove of him as a politician. And so these two things tend to get mixed together, but these are feces. This is Stephen Harper here, okay? And so there's a different kind of disgust that you feel for people and for things like feces and vomit and all that, just to clarify. So let me try and apply these ideas about this cognitive notion of emotion to the arts. And I just want to kind of use a very simple kind of a scheme. So here's a kind of a basic question that we ask in cognitive psychology of the arts. To what extent do artworks induce emotion in perceivers versus do they simply represent emotion? This is actually a very important question that we think about in the arts. So do we elicit emotion, or do we just simply represent emotion in artworks? And so I want to make this, I'm going to use color coding in the next few slides to kind of make this contrast. So when I talk about red, when I show red, it's going to be induced emotions, the emotion that a person feels when listening to, for example, music. These are true emotions, okay? So if you listen to a piece of music and you have a certain emotional response, that's going to be an induced emotion. Those are real emotions. In green, I'll talk about represented emotions, the emotion that the music expresses, the emotional content of a piece of music. These are not emotions. These are cognitive representations of emotions. So when we talk about people, people experience emotions, but pieces of music are not emotions. They represent emotion in some way, but they're not themselves emotions. They're the representations of emotion. So let me just show a very simple scheme that I present to my students in classes. So artworks, we feel, are expressive of emotion. In other words, artists express or communicate emotion through artworks. Hence, perceivers, like say us tonight at the concert, of these artworks have to recognize these emotions for the impact of the work to be realized. So artists, composers, performers, they imbue the artwork with a certain emotional quality, and we have to somehow decode this and interpret what the person means with their expression. When an artwork is most appreciated, the emotionally expressive character of the work elicits positive aesthetic responses. This category, the Clore and Ortney called aspects of objects. And so sometimes works have no particular impact on us, but when they really work for us, we're going to have this kind of positive emotional response that we're going to feel at its best. We can also have we can also feel repulsion, have a sense we don't like it, but when it really works, we're going to feel a positive aesthetic response when we experience it. The emotion expressed in the artwork can sometimes induce the same emotion in the perceiver. This process is called empathy. For example, a sad-sounding piece of music can make a person sometimes feel sad. But in general, that's not the case. In most cases, we interpret the sound, the emotion, in a virtual manner. And so we don't actually feel the emotion. We simply recognize the emotion. And so I'm sure you've had the experience you listen to music and you can say, oh, that's really happy music, but you don't feel happiness. Or you say, it sounds very sad, but you don't actually feel the sadness. You simply have a system that recognizes the emotional content. The induction part may or may not follow. In most cases, it doesn't. Okay, so I want to make this distinction between recognizing the emotional content of the piece versus your actual response, which may not follow that in general. Finally, artworks are also moral objects. You can also have this sense of a moral appraisal. For example, when I watch television, I have a very bad relationship with television, and so it's not just that I watch the shows and say, yuck, it's terrible. I say to myself, who the hell is responsible for this? I have this moral indignance. It's not just that they're aesthetically really repulsive, but it's like who's behind all this stuff on TV? So we have also moral responses to what we see in the arts. So a lot of work looking at that musical emotion shows that music is actually not a very good inducer of emotion, as shown here. The basic response we have in listening to music is an aesthetic one. We feel a sense of liking, disliking. It can be very intense. We have, very strong experiences. We feel chills. We can cry. We feel moved, whatever, transcendence. But in general, that's the major emotional response to something like music, and not so much the empathic induction of that same emotion. That can occur too, but that's much less common than simply having a very strong aesthetic response to what we hear. Okay, so now I want to talk about, what can music express? And so if you look at the other art forms like theater and dance and the visual arts, in terms of the three kinds of emotions, the three categories I talked about, I think they're all fairly effective at expressing all the three categories, so outcome emotions and aesthetic emotions and moral emotions. And they do so, say in the case of theater, using language, gesture, facial expression. Even in the absence of language, I think using facial expression and postures are good enough to convey a lot of all these categories of emotion. But what about music? And so people have debated for a long time, what does music express? What can it express? And so I'll just give you my take on this, and there's a lot of literature, especially from philosophers, on what music can express. And so people ask, can music really convey a sense of embarrassment and jealousy? And so I'm one of those people who says, no, it can't express shame and pride. For me, music is very good at this spectrum here about happy and sad. So what I'm calling outcome emotions, like being happy, being sad, being pleased. I think music is very good at expressing that spectrum of emotion. As far as the last category, shame and pride, embarrassment, I think I agree with other people that music is not very good at expressing things like jealousy and all that. As far as the second category, as far as representing beauty, in general, music tries to be beautiful to represent beauty. So, for example, in Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet, you have the Juliet theme. So Prokofiev tries to write a very beautiful theme to represent a beautiful subject, which is Juliet. So I think music can represent beauty by sort of embodying it, by being beautiful. So that's kind of my take, and I'll take that a bit further later on in the talk, but that music is kind of exclusively devoted to expressing sort of one category of emotions, these outcome emotions about happiness and sadness and things like that, and not the other categories of emotion. So to say this in other words, that music works by representing a general sense of sort of goodness, badness, like positivity, negativity, with whatever it's associated with. And so I think, so briefly stated, music is a prostitute. And I think this is maybe the best thing, the truest thing I can say about music. And I just had this podcast thing before this talk, and I spoke about this with Steve, what's his name, Steve? Yeah, thank you. So the book that Norman was talking about, this music and manipulation, so the major uses of music are sort of non-musical. Music becomes associated with everything under the sun. We see it all around us, TV commercials and restaurants, religion and all that. I mean, music is there to sort of prop up other things. And so we have certain musical devices that things, positive versus negative sounds, and music can reinforce other kinds of messages. And so music is a prostitute. And I like to tell the story that when I was working on this book, I was living in Stockholm, in Sweden in those days, there was lots of discussion in the media about the rise of neo-Nazi, what they call white noise music. And because I was working on this book, I really felt that I had to know something about this music. Fortunately or unfortunately, it was illegal to purchase it in Sweden, so it's kind of risky for me to actually get it, and I realize now I could have been deported and all that. But anyways, I went to an American website in New Jersey and decided to purchase the stuff online. And I got to say, the people were very, very nice. The Nazis were very, very friendly, very, very customer friendly. Now, because I said, I'm really worried about, getting caught. Immigration, they said, we pride ourselves on, customer satisfaction, and we have very discreet packaging. Don't worry about this. What's the point of all this? So, I got the stuff, and the content is just so vile. I mean, it's horrible stuff. But if you listen to the music sounds very, very similar to the music you're going to hear tonight by Schubert. It's the same chord sequences you find in typical Western classical music. So it's not that there are sort of, there's evil music and good music. There are evil associations and evil uses of music, but the music itself is rather neutral and very much, to me, a prostitute. It can kind of go wherever you want it to go and reinforce whatever message you want to get reinforced. And so I like this quote. It's not sort of a very pretty quote, but I think it's kind of the truest thing that we can say about the social uses of music. So let's talk about how music does what it does. And so I want to talk about I'm just going to focus now not on the induced emotions, but just talk about the representation of emotion in music, the emotional content. How does music convey these kinds of emotional things? And so I want to talk about sort of two different devices that music has. So I just want to, okay, I'm going to talk about sort of valence and intensity again, just to review the slide. I want to talk about two different ways that music can do what it does. On the one hand, we have these, what I'm going to call just generalized arousal mechanisms that convey something about the intensity of emotion. And I'm going to argue this one is very generic. It's shared with other things like speech and gesture. It's not specific to music. But then music has kind of its own unique thing, and that's the use of different kinds of scales that convey different kinds of emotion. And so I'm going to use the word mode tonight in the kind of technical sense to refer to musical scales. They're often referred to as modes. And so it makes kind of a nice phrase here, mode, emotion. But the use of different kinds of scales to convey different kinds of emotion, and this will be a way to signal valence. Let me talk about these two in sequence. And so there's some general ways of conveying emotional arousal, and the three most basic ones are register, high or low pitch, tempo, slow to fast, and volume, soft to loud. And so, for example, happiness is associated with high pitch, so high register, fast tempos, and loud volumes. And sadness is associated with the reverse spectrum, so it's low, it's slow, it's soft. And a lot of research has shown that there are very similar emotional meanings, emotional profiles between music and speech. So if you think about happy speech, happy music, they have essentially the same profile. They're both kind of high and fast and loud. I mean, if you apply this to gesture, same kind of thing. A person on a game show does this and they're screaming. And so when people are happy with their gesture, it's also kind of, it's high and it's fast and it's big compared to when they're depressed and it's low and it's slow and it's soft. Okay, so these things are very general forms of expression. They're not specific to music. They transcend music. They apply to speech, probably to gesture as much. These are ways of signifying something about arousal, high arousal, low arousal. So this is one way that music is able to convey emotion, especially intensity, is through register, tempo, and volume. But then music has its own special, unique way of conveying emotion, and that's through the use of different kinds of scale types. And so different emotional valences are associated with different scale types. This is music's most unique, domain-specific way of conveying emotion. And so the one that we all know about if we're Western musicians is the major versus minor difference. But I teach psychology of music, and I go through essentially most of the world of music, and there are lots of examples of this. The best case is the Indian classical music, the raga system. These are their scales. There are literally hundreds of different ragas that you find in Indian classical music, and they all have particular emotional connotations. So some are for the morning, some are for the afternoon, some are for the wet season, some for the dry season. They have very strong emotional connotations, and if you look across cultures, they have different scale types that convey different kinds of emotional meanings. And so major, minor is just one way of doing it, the one that we know best in our culture, but in many cultures they have these contrastive scale types where different scales connote different kinds of emotional meanings. So think about this. So here we have happy versus sad in facial expression. We know from physiology it takes literally dozens of muscles to make this contrast between the happy face and the sad face. But think about this contrast if you happen to read music and know about major and minor. This contrast between the major third and minor third is totally trivial. In terms of muscular production, if I were singing this, it's a very, very small change that I have to make in my laryngeal muscles to sing one or the other. So this is a really, really big deal. This one that we find in music is a small deal, but it leads to a really categorical change in the interpretation. So I just want to play sort of one example in each key, and you'll see even though we're making a very, very small change, the interpretation as far as happy and sad is a night and day kind of change. Ideally, I would have taken one piece and then transposed it major to minor. I don't have that. So let's just listen to a piece that's in a major key and then a very similar kind of orchestration, but in a minor key. Okay, so again, in terms of these arousal factors, loudness and tempo, whatever, pretty much the same. All we really changed there was something about the scale, and it sounds dramatically different in terms of our interpretation of the emotion. Okay, so then to just sum up what I've said, the music has kind of two different mechanisms. One are these generalized arousal mechanisms, like register and tempo and loudness. Then it has this more specific mechanism for different scale types. And importantly, these two different mechanisms can be varied independently. For example, a piece in a major key can be played in a high arousal or in a low arousal way. Likewise, a piece in a minor key can be played either way. And so we can imagine kind of a little 2x2 matrix like this. So on the one hand, we have sort of these valence mechanisms, so major and minor, and then we have the arousal things here, so low and high arousal. So if we take a piece in a major key and play it in a very tender, low arousal way, it's going to sound very tranquil, very sweet. If we play it in a high arousal way, it's going to sound happy, maybe even sound very heroic, like we just accomplished something very good, like in the Beethoven, we feel very heroic. On contrast, if we take the minor key, the negative valence, played in a very low arousal way, it could sound soft, even sound a little bit sinister, depending on context. If then we play it in this kind of high arousal way, it can sound very tragic, like the second Beethoven example, even fearful. And so what I'd like to do, kind of, I think it'll be my last thing, is play a few minutes from Hitchcock's Vertigo with music written by Bernard Herrmann, and just kind of demonstrate my point about these two different mechanisms. So I'm going to show two segments, two scenes, and let me just go through the musical analysis. So in the first scene, the tonality aspect is going to be major. So it's going to be sort of this happy, this positive valence. It's going to be a major key. In terms of the arousal mechanisms, it's all going to be very soft, very sweet. So it's going to be, this is very feminist. It's all about sort of the female character. So this representation is very much oriented towards sweet, feminine. At some point, there's kind of a big build-up in the orchestration that represents kind of a climax focused on the male, and I think his kind of interest in the character. But basically, it's all from this kind of positive emotion, major tonality. Most of it is very soft, very sweet, and then there's one climax that represents kind of attraction on the part of the male character. Then we're going to, okay, one thing I like about this segment, there are no words. I picked a segment that has, so there's no language to kind of confound the interpretation here. It's all done without words. It's just kind of scenes without any kind of language. Then we switch to the second scene. And again, it's going to be like the Beethoven. There's going to be this kind of night and day switch in tonality. It's going to go, it's not minor, but kind of a chromatic tonality. But now it sounds very negative, very kind of mysterious. And so that's going to be the biggest change, going from this kind of very positive, sort of happy thing to now this kind of dark, chromatic kind of tonality. At some point in the segment, we're going to have the return of the first theme. And it's going to be kind of the sense of relief. We have all this mystery, negativity, and then the positive theme. We're going to feel this kind of happiness, the return of the major key. Then it's going to go back to this kind of negative thing. In terms of the arousal factors, it's all very kind of subdued orchestration. It all sounds very sinister. So it's negative, but it's kind of low arousal, so it sounds very mysterious. It sounds very sinister. Okay, so I just want to show that these two things can be varied. They can be varied independently. As I say here, they're kind of independent. So this is the analysis. I'm going to show you about 5 minutes now from Vertigo. I want you to think about these factors, about tonality, about arousal factors, how they come to play with each other in these scenes. Okay, so I hope that example of... You got to rent it now to see what happens. No, I'm sure you've all seen Vertigo. Come on, you've all seen Vertigo. Yeah, I know that. Okay, so just kind of to summarize my points, and then I'll take questions for 50 minutes, whatever. So to summarize, as far as induction, so the major induced emotional response to music in general is an aesthetic response, not an induction of the expressed emotion. In terms of representation, music mainly expresses what Clore and Ortney call outcome emotions along the spectrum of happy and sad and that kind of emotion. And there seem to be two independent mechanisms of emotional representation, these generic arousal factors like register, tempo, and loudness, and then these very specific, music-specific, what I call mode emotion factors related to different kinds of scale types that have different emotive connotations. That's kind of my story for tonight. If you want to ask questions, we can, yeah.
One thing, you mentioned the three factors in terms of
Register and
there's one. You mentioned the three factors, and I would propose to you that there is actually a fourth.
I think there are more. Yeah, go ahead.
For want of better term, I'll call it punctuation,
Okay, yeah,
The different-
articulation.
Articulation,
Yep.
sostenuto versus staccato, for example. Even
Yep.
at the same tempo, the same pitch, everything else, you will evoke different reactions based on the punctuation of the material.
I agree. I think I simplify for this kind of a talk. I think articulation is one. I think timbre is going to be, and I think there are a lot of emotive connotations of orchestration and timbre. I was trying to just make it kind of simple and make a dichotomy between two factors. But I agree, when I teach this in the course, I do talk about articulation as a factor in this. But I think it's a great point that you bring up.
Can you speak to scientific tests of these notions, and how strong is the evidence
Scientific tests of,
the notions that you presented tonight?
okay, well, I presented many notions, so can you be more specific?
Well, actually, pick a central one, and then address scientific tests of that.
Okay. I think the biggest one is the thing about induction of emotion. And so I think people assume that, sad music is going to induce sadness. So that kind of thing has been pretty well studied. And so in general, music can induce these emotions, but it's very weak at doing them. But music is very good at bringing about aesthetic emotions. So the sense about liking and chills and, all that kind of stuff. Music is much better at doing that than at inducing these empathic emotions. So there are a lot of studies looking at that music can, like happy music can induce happiness, but it's a very small effect. But the biggest effect is this kind of aesthetic response in terms of this liking and all the physiological correlates that go like, the chills and tears and all that. You want more? I mean, that's kind of the...
How do they know that?
Oh, because they ask people to rate, their emotions after listening to pieces of different valence, and so they'll definitely see an effect going in the right direction. So a sad piece is more likely to induce a sad response than a happy response. But again, it's a small effect compared to other kinds of elicitors of emotion. So
How do you distinguish between induced emotions and actual crying and that sort of thing?
no, say it again.
I'm sorry, I got mixed up.
These are just
distinguish between the aesthetic emotion and the induced emotion experimentally.
Yeah, because there are different kinds of ratings. So one kind of rating is how much do you like it versus how sad. So they're kind of different dimensions of emotional rating. So for the empathic stuff, it's a sad piece, and now rate your sadness as a result of listening to a sad piece. The other one is how much do you like it, how much are you attracted to it, and so there are different kinds of rating scales for the likingness, like pleasantness versus happiness, sadness. So they're different scales for rating.
Okay, thanks.
So again, the effects for the empathic emotions, they're there, but they're small. But the ones for the pleasantness, like likingness, are much stronger effects in general, bigger effect sizes than what you get for the induced emotion.
Some of the factors that appear in writing about musical emotion didn't feature in your talk, like form and expectation,
Yep.
Harmony and dissonance. Are you ignoring these because they pretty much can be used in any kind of music?
Well, I mean, the harmony part is very much part of the modal part. I use scales as the example, but everything comes from the scale. So typically, in most musics, harmonies and melodies come from particular pitch sets. So if you talk about a scale, you're talking a lot about the tonal aspect of the music.
The odd dissonant chord, the suspension, that you would put that under the heading of mode, right?
Okay, but I'm going to ask you a question now.
Yeah.
So what kinds of emotions are you talking about for these kinds of...
Uneasiness, uncertainty, sort of challenging where you think you've been going.
I think I would think about it more as like a global, local thing. So for example, listening to the Beethoven, it was globally in C major, so we had this kind of global emotional response. Then, I agree, things happen in terms of musical form. We have these local suspensions of expectation, whatever. So I think it's all part of the same thing. It's just playing at different levels. But we have sort of like the scale kind of establishes a global feeling for the emotional tone. Then intrinsic to different elements, we have cadences, whatever. We play with it. But I think it's all part of the same thing with tonality. But yeah, no, this was a kind of a coarse-grained analysis that I presented. But I think it's sort of the tonal aspect that is you're addressing.
May I ask one
course.
other question? Often our reaction to pieces of music is modified by extrasonic factors. We know that this was, written in Mozart's difficult last year, or this stands as the summation of Schubert's, life vision. Would you feel, how do these kind of emotions fit in with what you've been talking about?
I think the first part, when I talked about the prostitute aspect, just about everything about music is extra musical. I mean, I think we have a few mechanisms here. We talk about tonality, but just about everything of our experience is really, as you're saying, moderated by, the context and there's so many other things. So there's very little actually about the music that probably comes into play in our feeling about it. So a lot of it is about extra musical things and social aspects. And like as I said during my podcast thing, that we're so accustomed to thinking about music for its own sake, but that's not the way most music is in world cultures. Music is really tied into particular social functions, and so you get a lot of meaning coming from that gathering, that context. We have this notion about absolute music. We just go sit in the concert hall, that's all there is. And that's very rare in terms of musical history and musical culture, music divorced from every other social aspect. So we get a lot about the meaning from music and the interpretation from the context and the occasion and all that. So I think, extra musical things are really critical.
So how much of this is hardwired versus learned?
Yeah, I mean, so, I teach, like I said, I teach cognitive psychology of music, and so I give examples of musical cultures from throughout the world. And so definitely tonal systems vary quite a bit. I mean, there are universals in music, but these kinds of scale factors are quite diverse cross-culturally. So I think, learning is going to play a very big part of it. I mean, there are certain features of music that are universal. Interval of the fifth is very common. The fact that we use steps and we don't glide, things like that. But within that pitch space, there's a lot of variation in how we make pitch sets and scales and tonal systems, and different ways of creating harmony, different textures, monophony, heterophony, whatever. So I would doubt that much is hardwired as far as tonality. I think we learn it. I mean, it's a balancing act. There's certain universal things, the tonic, fifth, and all that. But then there's lots of diversity cross-culturally in scale systems and the like. Well, I guess.
Do you think that people with perfect pitch are more sensitive?
To what?
These variations and these sounds, these different impulses.
I don't know literature looking at musical emotion between people with or without perfect pitch. There may be studies out there. I'm not aware of them. So I have a lot of friends with perfect pitch. I don't think that they experience music more deeply than I do. And I know lots of non-musicians, people with no musical background who have very, very strong emotions. I don't think your background determines your responsiveness to musical sound. Particular styles, yes, but as far as just a general feeling for music, it doesn't require conservatory training or perfect pitch. So I don't know, as far as studies about comparing responses, I don't know studies that have looked at that. So.
I have just a personal observation and also a question. I remember when I was a child, I would often get that the minor key Beethoven in my head a lot when I was upset. And
this one?
Yeah,
okay.
The one you played. And it still happens whenever my mind starts racing or I get very upset about something or feel stressed out. I notice it'll pop in immediately over and over again. I've heard it called earworms, those things which come, but it's quite constant for me, and that's how it's a cognitive trigger for me to realize, oh, I'm upset. I've got Beethoven. So the other, that was an observation, the question is, I wonder, or rather it's a hypothesis, I wonder if people seek out certain kinds of music that are correlated with, tranquil, sweet, or tragic, fearful, or happy, heroic, because that's how they're already feeling. They don't want to feel alone.
Okay, so I anticipated your question. So I brought a slide just to answer, because I knew someone was going to ask that question.
Thank you.
So, yes. So typically we make a distinction between, we can call them homeopathic and allopathic. I just take this from medicine. And so the homeopathic use, you just made allusion to this, is treating like with like. So if you're really in a bad mood, play something which is really dark and depressing and angst-filled. Allopathic is treating like with its contrary. That means if you're really upset, play something very pleasant and happy and relaxing. So if you talk to people, they kind of do both things at different times. Sometimes when you're really angry, you want to hear an angry piece. A happy piece makes you even angrier. Other times, you just need, you need something very relaxing and soothing. And so we can talk about this. Actually, in the book, I talk about this homeopathic versus allopathic uses of music. And so people treat themselves both ways. Sometimes, like I said, sometimes they treat anxiety with anxiety-sounding music. Other times, it's with the opposite, with something very soothing and relaxing. So people do both, and they seem to be effective in different ways for different people in different contexts. Is that what you're getting at? No, but go ahead. I want to hear your hypothesis.
I'm thinking of the like with like.
So if you're feeling sad, you want to hear sad-sounding music to overcome, to reinforce it, or
I was assuming it would treat it because one would be reminded, oh, I'm not the only one. Because there's so much that goes along with emotion. What sort of concretizes it and keeps it there is thinking, I'm all alone with this, or there's something wrong with the fact that I'm feeling this way. So being reminded.
Through the composer, you mean, or through the?
Through the whatever the music represents.
Okay.
Is a reminder. So that was a specific hypothesis around the homeopathic use.
Have they done any studies on chemical changes in the brain through scans or through other modes of testing to see when people listen to music, what happens in different areas of the brain?
Okay. The first part of your question was about chemical changes.
Chemical changes
Yeah.
in the brain that may occur by stimulation.
I don't know about studies that have looked at chemical changes. So the technique called PET, or positron emission tomography, can look for changes in receptor binding. I don't know of any studies that have done that for music, but there's a lot of stuff, non-chemical methods looking at brain activation when people listen to music which they like. And so, or when people get chills when they listen to music. And so, yeah, I mean, so the story for that is that there seem to be sort of parts of the brain that are active when you like something. So I talked about these aesthetic emotions. In terms of the brain, they seem to be kind of generic. And so kind of the same general part, it's called orbital frontal cortex, is activated when you listen to music you like, eat chocolate, watch pornographic films. No, I mean, it's like there's kind of like, I don't want to say a pleasure center, but kind of an aesthetic center that gets stimulated by all different kinds of sensory modalities. So if you look at studies on sniffing pleasant odors and tasting pleasant foods and classical music or music you like, they all seem to be directed towards the same general part of the brain, this orbital frontal cortex involved in aesthetic appraisals of objects. And so this Clore-Ortney story, I didn't talk about it neurally, but actually fits in very nicely with neuroscience data. And so having three different foci kind of fits in with sort of three brain areas that may be specialized for, on the one hand, motivational things versus aesthetic things versus moral, social appraisals. So I didn't talk about that today, but there's actually a pretty good correlation between these cognitive foci and then brain areas that seem to be specialized for those different kinds of appraisals.
A couple of questions from a composition point of view. If you're writing a piece of music, knowing or based upon your hypothesis here, if you want to induce or want to trigger an emotion in your audience, do you write the piece in a major key? If you want them to be happy, do you write it in a minor key or a suspended? You know,
are you a composer yourself?
Well, I'm a musician.
Do we have one in the audience? I mean.
The second part of that question is, what are the implications of your findings for music therapy?
So those are two very different questions. Let me do the second one first, because there's been so much stuff, I think also in this country but elsewhere, about Mozart effects and things like that. I think the bottom line for music therapy, because I've done some consulting on dementia studies, is that you have to use music that people have some kind of connection with, music that they like. And so there's no all-purpose musical elixir, Mozart or otherwise. I mean, I happen to not like Mozart so much, so it wouldn't work for me if I was in some kind of, home for the elderly kind of thing. And so, I mean, I have friends who do sort of cross-cultural music therapy, and so if they're working with Iranian immigrants, they have to find music. For music therapy, you have to find music that comes from their culture, that appeals to them. So this whole thing about there's a general purpose musical elixir and it's Mozart or anything else is totally wrong. And so for music therapy, you've got to play with these aesthetic emotions and play with people's social context, the things you mentioned, and find ways to play into their taste and things that are meaningful for them. So there's no, like I said, all-purpose cure-all for music. Then the first part was about the composers. I assume that composers do want to elicit responses in their listeners, and they do play with a lot of conventional things, like these conventional harmonic things, and then surprise and things that are unexpected, and you talked about the expectation and all that. So some kind of balance between things that are conventional enough that mean things to people from your culture, and then enough surprises to make it not seem too conventional and just a repetition of something done before. So I guess it has to be a balancing act. I mean, so who mentioned Schoenberg? Somebody mentioned Schoenberg. Okay, so he had to form a private society, basically in his living room, because nobody really liked his music at the time, and so he had to have kind of a little gathering just of those few people at the time who, so he had this private performance society, I forget the name of it, and so you have to kind of walk the line between having some kind of mass appeal and sort of having your voice as a composer. So, but I can't speak from it as a composer. Just I assume that's the case. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Actually, my question has to do with that, whether you've asked any composers when they're, for example, you dealt with Bernard Herrmann.
Yeah.
He had to understand what Hitchcock wanted in order to compose that music. And the question I would have to the composer is, are you searching for that true emotion? And how do you know when you've got it? Or do you have to have a sitting, like the Schoenberg sittings, where you have knowledgeable friends who can respond? In other words, when the composer is writing, what he hears in his head, it has to be true to what he thinks is his emotion, but he's still not sure what the listener will.
But I mean, in the case of a film, compared to, say, Schoenberg just composing abstract music for a concert setting, here there's a really nice, there's a very strong narrative element here. So he's trying to make music that's going to fit a particular narrative. There are many, many ways of creating music for those scenes. He picked a very nice one, I think. But I mean, so for him, he has a very strong, roadmap there, because he has to write music for the scene in the restaurant and then the scene in the flower shop and all that. So it's not just going to be some abstract thing coming out of his head. He has to make a pretty good match between the emotions that are conveyed in the scene and the emotions in the music. So, and many times it doesn't work. You hear film music that just, you think it's not appropriate or it's not whatever. He happened to be very good, and he uses all the idioms of, late 19th century, early 20th. You talk about Schoenberg. I mean, he follows all those conventions. It's very Debussy-esque. I mean, the kinds of tonality he's using. So he's borrowing lots and lots from concert music to make this kind of film score. But again, so it's not just abstract stuff. He has something there that he has to write music for, and that thing came before his music. He writes music to it.
Well, there are some composers that may hit the truer emotion, I think is what I'm getting to. For example, Bach. In St. Matthew Passion, there are passages which induce a very intense emotion, at least for me. And the content is very specific. We know what that content is. Is it because he's a better, greater composer that he gets to the heart of that emotion?
I mean, it's kind of like my comment about the Iranian immigrants. It's really personalized, and so, Bach works for you and not for other people. And he was obviously a very skilled composer, and there's no question about that. But it all comes down to taste, and even among, I'm a classical music person, but there are many things that I don't like that most classical music fans do like, and so everybody has their own taste, and it varies quite a bit. And many skilled composers out there, and some work for me, some work for you, and yeah.
Music as a prostitute. What about someone like Yanni?
No, but the comment was totally general. It wasn't about any one person's music or one use. It was just generically that if you forget about concerts, music for its own sake, absolute music, then most music has an association with some kind of context. Like the example I gave was, all these neo-Nazi things, get rid of these people and all that. It could be something more socially positive, like the music therapy thing. But in general, music has a connection with other things in society and reinforces those messages. And those composers are trying to, you see it all the time, like this very schmaltzy, happy music when it's a scene which is supposed to be socially positive and recovering from the operation and all that kind of stuff. All these conventions, and they've been used for, since the age of film music when you had really, pianists or organists improvising, and there were these conventions for the storm scene and for the love scene, and you find it from opera for many centuries and all that. So, no, music is there to kind of do other things and reinforce other kinds of messages. Except now we have concerts where we just go and listen to music and that's it. But that's not the norm, either historically or cross-culturally. That's not the norm. Yeah.
I guess this whole context has made me feel somewhat uncomfortable, and I think it's maybe I can try to articulate why. And I think it's because there's sort of an underlying contradiction. I'm not going to be able to really slam it, but maybe I can try and get at it. And it goes something like this. You seem to be arguing fairly strongly that the emotional relationship between music and emotion is purely conventional. It's not innate. It's just, it's whatever we happen to learn as a result of what we hear all the time or the culture we grew up in and all that kind of stuff. I think I'm not really misrepresenting you, at least not grossly.
It wasn't part of my talk. I kind of addressed the question that way. I wasn't trying to make a strong point about the fact that
no, you weren't.
Universals and all that.
Yeah, I may be stretching. Maybe you can tell me if I'm stretching things. So if that was really true, then music really wouldn't ever change, would it? Because the best emotional music would just play on the conventions that we've already learned.
But those conventions vary strikingly cross-culturally and historically.
Right, cross-culturally there would be innovation, but in a particular culture, for example, in Western classical music, there would never be any innovation. There wouldn't be, there shouldn't be, if your theory is right.
No, but I wasn't making the argument against innovation at all. I hope
I know you don't.
I didn't come across
that's
that
what
way.
I mean. You don't want to make that claim at all.
No, there's cultural evolution of music every generation.
And when a composer, this relates to other questions, when a composer sits down to write a piece of music, certainly the great composers, innovation was something that was very much at the forefront of what they were trying to achieve. And Beethoven comes to mind, and his string quartets.
If I can get you out of Beethoven and go to a church, for example, if you look at religious music, you don't want to have a lot of innovations. I mean, those things are very conservative because they're very important. Beethoven, we don't care so much about concert music. It doesn't really affect our survival nearly as much as things that are ritual and ceremonial. So if you look at music of the Australian Aborigines, every recording I have sounds exactly the same because they don't believe in having a lot of change. They don't want the new version of their song. They want the same old version that's been around for maybe thousands of years. So yeah, I mean, Beethoven's kind of music is a bit freer to change. But think about music, say more ancestrally, like religious music. You don't want just the top 40 kind of changes to the songs. You want those same old hymns and tunes that have been around for generations. And so there are kinds of music that you do want to grow and change. Other kinds of music you want to be very conservative and be kind of the cornerstone of your musical society.
So what happens if I articulate what you just said by saying the following? Music that is a prostitute is music that doesn't want to change, but there's some other kind of music that doesn't prostitute that you haven't talked about yet.
No, I think it applies to all musics. I mean, there's a tendency for things to change, with new generations. Some are more resistant to change, especially in a more religious or ritual context. Others, because they have less connection with survival, whatever, they're more part of, say, pleasure or recreation. Yeah, I didn't see it. Okay, they can change more freely. But there are certain songs that we have a very strong attachment to. We don't want them to change. Others change weekly, it seems. Like in pop culture, there's new movements every few months. So, yeah, no, it's funny. Even when I don't talk about musical emotion in my talks, it gets to this. So I thought, okay, just give a talk about this so it's good. There's so many questions, but it always comes down to something about why do I feel the way I do when I listen to music, and so people always want to know about that. So I tried to give some take on what might be going on. In terms of how music does what it does. So, are we out of time?
Yep.
Okay.
Before we adjourn, I'd like to invite you all to come back next week for the next Music in the Brain, where we will talk about all this. It's the talk, Halt or I'll Play Vivaldi. And you know what that'll get you. So Jackie Helfcott from Seattle University and I will be talking about music and crime and how classical music is used to quell crime. We'll talk about what they do in train stations and all that kind of stuff. So that's where we'll really get into all this kind of stuff.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.